Hi, and welcome to Piano TV. So last week we talked about Mozart and his life and all the crazy things that went through his life. And this week what we're going to talk about is the music he composed. So I'm going to give you a snapshot view of some of the various genres that he composed in and works that I think are really representative of Mozart. This might be one of those situations though where maybe you have a favorite Mozart song but I don't put it on this video. So everyone's personal taste is going to be a little bit different, but this is what I thought would be a good mix of Mozart. So let's get started. Today we're going to be focusing on more of Mozart's keyboard-specific works because this is a piano channel, so that's our lean. But we will also touch on some other genres that he wrote in too, like opera and symphony and string quartets and quintets, as well as the piano sonatas and concertos that we'll talk about. Since Mozart was a composer from a very young age and a child prodigy, and he grew up playing the keyboard, he also wrote a lot of small-scale keyboard works, but we're not really going to talk about those today. We're just going to talk about some of the larger compositions that he composed. The first genre that we're going to talk about today are concertos. Now, Mozart wrote 27 concertos, and concertos are large-scale compositions, and they're very virtuosic, tomato, but they require a lot of skill to play. So, unsurprisingly, Mozart performed a lot of his concertos himself because he was super awesome. And he composed the majority of his concertos between 1782 and 1786. So since he wrote 27 of them, that's actually quite a bit condensed in a very small amount of time, especially if you consider that a concerto is usually 20 to 30 minutes long. They're pretty hefty pieces, so he was very productive writing them in that short span of time. And we're mainly going to talk about the piano concertos because it's a piano channel. We already talked about that. But I also do want to look at his violin concertos, which are super sweet. They're really awesome. And he wrote concertos for other instruments too, like cello and horn and stuff, which you can get into and look into if that's up your alley. Mozart's Piano Concerto number 20 in D minor is one of his major works, and it's really famous. If you've seen the movie Amadeus, the second movement actually plays at the end of the credits, so you'll recognize it. But so it's in the key of D minor, which seems like, oh, no big deal, D minor, right? But it is a big deal because Mozart barely wrote music in minor keys, which minor keys have like a darker sound to them. So mostly he wrote upbeat, positive sounding music, but this was one of two concertos in a minor key, so it's kind of special. And when it premiered in Vienna, when Mozart performed it for the public, his father happened to be in Vienna at the time and wrote to Mozart's sister Nannerl about how awesome it was. Other people who loved this concerto, including but not limited to Beethoven and Stalin. Here's what it sounds like. His Piano Concerto number 21 in C major was written just 1 month after the Concerto number 20 that I just showed you, which is crazy considering, this guy has a busy life. It's not like he was just sitting around writing concertos. He was making a living doing other things. And his father, Leopold, described this piece as astonishingly difficult. So what's most difficult about it isn't necessarily that there's like large leaps or really fast notes or any of those things that we expect is difficult. It's actually just conveying a very smooth, elegant sound. And it's not one of those pieces that sounds as hard as it is, and I think there lies the beauty of it. The only violin concertos that Mozart would ever write were when he was 19 years old and living in Salzburg, and he wrote 5 of them. But they're really great, and they're considered repertoire staples across the globe. Now, they're not earth-shattering or anything. They're not super crazy or really innovative, like later violin concertos by Beethoven or Brahms, but they're still really nice, and they have Mozart's trademark style, which is a beautiful lyrical melody, and you can really hear an operatic his operatic style throughout them with elements of surprise and intrigue and fun. So they're just very exciting pieces. And Mozart would have often performed as the solo violinist for these pieces because he was a great violin player, which not everyone knows. And his dad always told him, well, maybe he didn't always tell him, how do we know? I wasn't there. But he said, you yourself, Mozart, do not know. Well, I probably would have adjusted him as Wolfgang. You yourself, Wolfgang, do not know how well you play the violin. Mozart's Violin Concerto, number 3 in G major, is just a standard 3-movement concerto with a pretty famous second movement, like the slow adagio section that also includes the fancy edition of flutes. So that's kind of fun. This is also nicknamed the Strasburger because it included in the third movement part of a tune from a song that was from Strasbourg. So just kind of fun fact. The Violin Concerto number 5 in A major is also worth mentioning. It's nicknamed Turkish because in the third rondo movement, it kind of has part of like a Turkish sounding element to the music because it switches to like a 2/4 time signature and it switches to A minor, so it sounds all ethnic and funky. Because at the time in Austria, there was conflict with Turkey, so that ended up having a result of influencing a lot of the Western composers to write music with more of an Eastern flair. Mozart composed 18 piano sonatas in his lifetime, and while these aren't his most breathtaking, ridiculous pieces or works that he ever composed, a lot of them will probably be familiar to you, especially if you grew up with any sort of piano background. And there's some really great nuggets in here. Mozart's Sonata number 8 in A minor is one of only 2 minor key sonatas that he wrote for piano. And as we talked about, Mozart writing in a minor key was a really rare thing. Now, this is a piece where you can just hear the anguish. There is so much anguish. It was like Mozart saved up all of his horrible emotions and poured them into this piece. And he wrote it when he was living in Paris. It was a really bad time in his life. His mom just died. His dad blamed him for his mom's death. So the song is just heartbreaking, but it's really great. His Sonata 11 in A major is really well known because of the third movement, Rondo alla Turca, or Turkish March. If you do not know this, I would be really surprised. I think everyone knows this tune. It's a gooder. The Sonata number 16 in C major is one of those pieces that, again, if you grew up with any sort of piano background, you will know this song. Mozart wrote it specifically for beginners or with beginners in mind to help them develop their skills. And this tends to be one of those pieces that piano players really get excited to learn and get under their belt. Mozart wrote 41 numbered symphonies in his lifetime, which if you think that he only lived till he was 35, so that's more than one symphony a year, even if you include when he was 0 and 1 years old, which is some amazing output, especially compared to modern day musicians where it's you get an album every 3 years and it's only 45 minutes long, where a single symphony is 20 to 30 minutes long and he wrote 41 of them. 41. That's a lot. Mozart's 25th Symphony in G minor, also called Little G minor, is a song that you'll probably recognize if you've seen the movie Amadeus because it plays in the opening. And it's one of the rare minor key compositions that Mozart wrote, as we know. Now, this one is thought to be directly inspired by Mozart's bro Haydn, who also wrote a G minor sonata sort of around the same time, his 39th sonata in G minor. So there's probably some direct takeaways because Mozart was only 17 at the time and drawing heavily from his, what do you call them? The people who inspire you. Inspirees? The Symphony number 31 is dubbed Paris because it was composed in Paris, it was premiered in Paris, and we all know that Mozart had a terrible time when he was in Paris. His mom died and he went broke and he couldn't find any work that he liked, but he did have a really good opportunity in that he got to compose a symphony in Paris using Paris's huge orchestra. So that was good. This is a great symphony because it's full of like razzle dazzle. It's a really like energetic, enthusiastic piece to please the Parisians and everyone else. Mozart's 35th Symphony is dubbed Haffner because the Mozarts were friends with the Haffners. They were a prominent family in Salzburg. And when one of the Haffner guys was upgraded in life to nobility status, Mozart was asked to write a symphony for the occasion. And he did, and it was awesome, and everyone loved it. There was lots of applause. The venue was sold out in Vienna, and there's pretty much nothing else that a musician can ask for, right? Since Mozart's opera, The Marriage of Figaro, did so well in Prague, he was invited back to premiere a symphony. So that's why his 38th symphony is nicknamed Prague. No fancy explanation there. But this is a good one because it really advanced Mozart's symphonic technique in that he included a lot of wind instruments, which would influence his bro Haydn as well as his predecessors Beethoven and Schubert, because up until this point the symphony was really dominated by string instruments and string instrument passages. So to start including and giving a more prominent role to flutes and woodwinds really changed the game. The final symphonies that Mozart ever wrote were the 39th, 40th, and 41st one, and he wrote them all in a span of 2 months in the summer before he died, where he was undergoing this huge rebirth in his productivity after being miserable and depressed and broke. So these are kind of breakthrough works, and at the time they really challenged audiences because they were difficult. They weren't, I don't know, to us, we might not be able to distinguish like the 41st symphony versus like his 20th or whatever, but to audiences at the time, they were really complex and not just easy listening. Mozart's final symphony, his 41st one, is also his most longest, there's some good English, and it's nicknamed Jupiter. Now, this one is so remarkable because at the end of the fourth movement, there's a 5-part fugue going on, and a fugue is basically just, you can think of it as 5 different melody lines happening all at once in a crazy mashup. It's pretty awesome. Great Mass in C minor is one of only two big religious vocal works that he composed, and he actually never finished either one of them, but we'll get to that. He was newly married to Constance, and apparently he wrote in a letter to his dad that when he brought Constance to Salzburg, he was going to write a mass to celebrate the occasion. And he gave Constance a solo part for the performance, so that was kind of cool. Now, the reason this wasn't finished, well, we're not really sure why, but it's thought that since this was just a composition for fun, it wasn't for income, that it might have just fallen by the wayside. But what I think is that since the movements that were finished were super awesome, Mozart felt that he couldn't write anything to that caliber, like he lost inspiration for it and left it unfinished. His other great vocal work, which we'll talk about, Requiem, he didn't finish because he died, so that one's a little bit of an easier one to explain. The Requiem Mass in D minor was left unfinished because Mozart died, like I just mentioned. Now, the main reason that I'm mentioning this one is because there's just so much mythology surrounding it and what happened. So basically, when Mozart died, he had only finished the first movement, but it was a really lucrative commission. So his wife Constance was like, crap, still want to cash in on this and get the dollar bills. So what she did is she secretly hired other musicians to finish the composition and pretend it was Mozart all along. So I guess that's what happens. Of the string quartets that Mozart composed, arguably some of the most famous are the set of 6 called the Heightened Quartet, Opus 10. So, as we all know, Mozart and Haydn were bros, and when they became friends in Vienna, Haydn, well, first of all, Haydn is known as the father of the string quartet because he wrote a whole bunch of them and basically developed the genre. So Mozart had written some string quartets back in the day, but when he was kind of inspired by some of Haydn's newer quartets, so he's like, I'm going to try my hand at this again. And they ended up being repertoire staples even today. And he called them the Haydn quartets because he just dedicated them to his friend Haydn because he's a nice guy and they loved each other. It was very sweet. Mozart and Haydn often had jams in Mozart's Vienna apartment, and Mozart would play the viola and Haydn would play the violin. So yeah, they were best friends. I just think it's kind of a fun fact. The string quartet that we're going to look at, number 19, Dissonance, is called such because, surprise, surprise, it's kind of dissonant, and listeners at the time thought it was particularly difficult to listen to and probably to play. But I'm not a violinist, so I wouldn't know. No discussion of Mozart's music would be complete without a foray into opera, his true love. He loved writing opera and he was really good at it. And some of his most famous operas are Don Giovanni, or The Magic Flute, or The Marriage of Figaro. And since these are such huge, 3-hour long operas, we're not going to look at the music individually, but we will talk a little bit about those specific operas. In 1786, The Marriage of Figaro premiered, which was a collaboration between Mozart and the librettist Lorenzo da Ponte. And since it was really successful, they ended up collaborating again and releasing Don Giovanni in the next year as another successful opera collab. So with The Marriage of Figaro, Mozart found it. It was a play kind of unknown by a writer named Beaumarchais, and Mozart thought it was awesome because it was super racy, and it was even banned in Vienna at the time for being too racy. But they were able to get it approved for opera, I guess, for some reason. It works out for them anyway. The Magic Flute is actually a singspiel, which is a type of opera where there's singing and spoken word stuff. And this did really, really well. And Mozart was like, he'd been kind of sick at the time. He was sick for a few weeks, but then when it premiered, he was super pumped up and it lifted his spirits. And Constance wasn't with him at the time, but he wrote her to tell her how full the concert hall was and how much people seemed to love it and how many pieces were encored. So he was so proud of it, and he went and saw it a whole bunch of times. Like, he would bring friends and family with him to watch his own operas. I would be remiss if I were not to mention Mozart's super famous piece for chamber ensemble called Ein klein Nachtmusik, which is translating very roughly. Right now I'm competing with the sound of my cat in the litter box, sorry guys. Ein klein Nachtmusik we know in English as a little night music, and if you haven't heard this, you've been living under a rock. Hopefully this gives you just a taste of some of the wide variety of music that Mozart composed in his lifetime. And if you want to get more information on the music that was played in this video, just look at the description bar below or the blog. You'll find all the details there if you want to explore further. And of course, if you didn't see last week's video on the life and times of Mozart, you should check that out, because these two videos are like peas in a pod. They go together. Thank you for watching this video, and as always, subscribe and leave comments if you have any suggestions, or maybe you are really angry at me for leaving like a certain Mozart tune out. Please let me know below, and I will see you next time. Meow. Meow.